So welcome everyone. I'm Tim Watkins with the National Park Service, currently serving in a temporary role at Acadia National Park. And welcome to today's brown bag presentation. We have with us, very kindly joining us, is Dr. Jay Wason from the University of Maine. He's a forest ecologist and also a tree physiological ecologist who has a lot of interest in how forests and how trees at the organismal level respond to climate change. 2 years ago, in 2020, Dr. Wason received a Second Century Stewardship Fellowship Award from Schoodic Institute and Acadia National Park. And with that award, he began some research at Acadia on how fairly old spruce forests in the park and elsewhere in Maine are expected to be affected by climate change and respond to climate change and what that might mean for management. He's done some other work on the physiology and anatomy and architecture of tree tissues and how they respond to climate change. And so he's got a broad range of interests, all of which are united by how things respond to our changing climate. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jay Wason. And Jay, thanks so much again for taking the time to join us today.
Great, thank you, Tim, and thanks everyone for joining today on a beautiful lunchtime brown bag lunch. I wish we were sitting at a picnic table together chatting about this near the ocean rather than all at our computers, but that's all right. So I've been at the University of Maine now for about 4 years in the School of Forest Resources. And as Tim mentioned, my research program centers around trying to understand generally how forests respond to climate change and climate stressors. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we're learning about what's happening along the coast of Maine and some of the coastal forests that we all know and love so well, and hopefully provide you with maybe some new information or new ways of looking at some of those changes that'll spur some discussion. First, I just want to start with a couple of acknowledgements. When I started here 4 years ago, I hadn't done any work in coastal spruce ecosystems at all. I have Sean Fraber initially to blame for that, but also a couple of other folks through the Park Service and through the Schoodic Institute that showed me how interesting these coastal spruce-fir ecosystems were. And I have some experience working in spruce-fir forests and looking at climate change impacts there. So it was really a natural transition to start looking at these coastal systems. Special shout out to the Schoodic Institute and Acadia National Park for the Second Century Fellowship and all the other organizations that have helped to fund some of the research projects that I'll be talking about today, including a number of graduate students who have worked on some of these research projects that I'll be sharing some data from today as well. And so the project that I initially worked on through the Second Century Fellowship was looking at these older spruce forests in Acadia National Park. And in the late 1950s, Ron Davis was a faculty member here at the University of Maine. He went out to a number of stands along the coast of Maine that he identified as some of the oldest spruce stands on the coast. And he measured them for vegetation composition, structure, and a number of other things. Really important data set. He published some interesting work from that. But those sites have rarely been visited since the late 1950s. And so as part of the Second Century Fellowship, we went back to 6 and in the end, actually 7 of those sites in the park. And we examined 3 key things. We looked at the forest dynamics, so how those forests changed over the last 60 years. We looked at the tree growth of some of the dominant and co-dominant trees, in particular spruce at those stands, to see how they're responding to climate. And we also measured the unique climate in the understory of some of these coastal spruce-fir stands so that we can start to better understand how the microclimate conditions in the understory relate to their persistence. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of those results today, and a lot of that work is ongoing still. So this is a map actually that Ron Davis produced from that survey in the late 1950s. This is actually the coast of Maine here, and he did aerial surveys in an airplane where he identified where he found coastal spruce-fir ecosystems. And so these darker black areas are where he identified more than 2/3 of the tree species were spruce and fir. So right away, you can recognize where we've got Mount Desert Island here, and you can see where we've got a lot of spruce fir on the southern and the western side of the mountain. And then as we head out into the Penobscot Bay, it's really, really dense spruce fir. And you can see, as we all know, as you move further and further down the coast, further south and west, we get less and less spruce fir. It becomes more and more isolated. And this has been a really important piece of discussion as we think about the potential refugia that the coastal ecosystems might provide for these spruce fir forests. So that's a lot of what kind of spurred our interest in this system. But this map actually, while it does provide a lot of value and gives us a good strong understanding of where we think most of the spruce fir forests are, is really imperfect. I think we can do a lot better, especially with some of the new technologies we have. And so just as an example here, we can look in just south of Rockland here at Owl's Head, and we can take a look at an aerial photograph and we can say, okay, well, it looks like there's forests there. Ron Davis didn't see any spruce fir there. Let's see what we could see today, 60 years later. You can't quite tell, it just looks like trees, right? So there's definitely trees on that landscape. But Google has pictures of everything, so you can just click on one of these little blue dots, and lo and behold, if you're sitting on that little bench, you'll be in the shade of some spruce trees on the coast. And so there are spruce trees, and if you actually turn around 180 degrees, you can see there's a forest of spruce right behind us. And so I just want to present this as a way to keep in context as we talk about the future conservation value and climate change implications for spruce fir forests. I think we still have a lot to learn about even where these coastal spruce fir forests are. We have quite a bit to learn too about how their management and conservation may impact those responses. So let's take a look at some of the data that we have from those 7 unique sites on Mount Desert Island. So when Ron Davis surveyed these in the 1950s, they were some of the oldest spruce stands. He was trying to characterize some of the older late stage structure of spruce forests. And then they have had another 60 years since then to continue to grow and for forest dynamics to continue to develop. So this is a map demonstrating where those sites are. And then each of these images here is actually a stem map of where each individual tree is in a 10-meter by 200-meter plot. So these are actually foreshortened on the y-axis. So they're actually really long, narrow plots. And we measured and mapped every single tree in each of those plots. And so the dark green represents a live tree and the gray symbols represent dead trees. So we can use that data, and we're going to be using that more and more to start understanding how neighborhood effects and competition from neighboring trees impacts things like climate sensitivity to growth of those trees. But initially what we were doing with that is really just trying to get a sense of what are the forest dynamics, how are they changing over time for these 7 different stands. And so these are some data that have been worked up by Camilla Sierra, whom many of you probably know. She's a graduate student here at the University of Maine working on this project with me, and she's advised by Sean Fravor, the person who I blame for getting me interested in coastal spruce ecosystems initially. And so here we're looking at diameter class distributions from those 7 sites. And so the x-axis is the diameter class of these live trees at those sites from 2 centimeters, 2.5 centimeters, so about 1 inch in diameter, all the way up to 50 to 60 centimeters, the largest trees. And the y-axis is just how many stems per hectare you have. So further up on that axis is a higher density of that tree size. And what we can see is a couple of things. So if we take a look at Otter Point and Bass Harbor Head initially, you can see that the light green color, the 1959 survey, is quite different than the dark green color, the 2020 and 21 surveys that we just completed. And that's because there's been some blowdown at both of those locations. And so Bass Harbor Head has a huge influx of small size classes of trees. And so they've had that's a regeneration response to a major blowdown at Bass Harbor Head. And a similar thing has happened at Otter Point. We can also see that there's 2 other unique structures, Ironbound Island and Western Mountain. So these are some of our older stands and more old growth condition type stands. And at these stands, we have this classic inverse J-shaped distribution for the size class, where we have a lot of small trees and fewer trees as we move into these larger size classes. But you can notice that that hasn't changed very much since the 1960s. And so these are stands that are more in a steady state dynamic where you've got individual tree fall gaps that are driving regeneration in those gaps, but you also still have large old trees as well. So those are some of our older stands. And then the 3 other remaining stands are kind of in this, just continuing to age and grade and move up. So for Beech Mountain, for example, well, Beech Mountain has had like a little punch of regeneration pop in, but for Palmetto Mountain, you can see we had a lot of relatively small trees, and now as those trees thin, as they get larger and you have fewer and fewer of them, it's kind of flattening out that curve. And eventually that canopy will start to open up and you'll see an influx of regeneration in the understory like we're starting to see at Beech Mountain already. So that's what it looks like when you look at the data, but I wanted to also give you some images or some pictures to think about what this actually looks like on the ground. So many of you are probably familiar with this type of landscape as you walk through these coastal spruce ecosystems. So I'm going to show you 3 examples. So here we've got Bass Harbor Head on the left, Blackwoods in the middle here, and Western Mountain on the right. So these are kind of our 3 different conditions. Right away, you can see Bass Harbor Head. That's where I told you there was a bunch of blowdown. We've had a big regeneration response. You can see that there's a lot of standing dead trees. If we look at the basal area of the sand, it's not very high. But if you look at the coarse woody debris volumes, that's how much downed wood there is at the stand, 160 meters cubed per hectare. So that's a lot of downed wood at those stands. Maybe kind of hard to tell, but that's actually Sean. That's his backpack. He's attached to it on the other side. This is a very dense stand and a tough stand to work in with all that down woody debris and the regeneration response. In contrast to that, one of the easiest stands to work in is Blackwoods. And so if you've hiked through Blackwoods, it's like hiking through a park in some ways, where you've got almost no regeneration in the understory right now and a relatively tall, even age structure. Very little coarse woody debris and a relatively high basal area for that stand, actually. So there's a lot of standing wood here and a lot of competition between those trees. And then you can contrast that to one of our older stands. This is the Western Mountain stand that hasn't really changed very much. And you can see just in this image that we have a wide range. So we've got some large trees, we've got some coarse woody debris down, and there's some regeneration response to some of that, those tree fall gaps. So the basal area is a little bit lower than at Blackwoods, and the coarse woody debris volume is kind of in the middle. We're kind of more at kind of a steady state. So that gives you a picture of what those different dynamics look like. So this is over a 60-year time period, but Blackwoods and a couple of these other stands are relatively unique because we can go back actually 12,000 years if we want to. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this paper, The Persistence of Coastal Spruce Refugia During the Holocene in Northern New England, detected by stand scale pollen stratigraphy. So this is some work that came out of the University of Maine in 2002. And in this case, they were looking at pollen, layers of pollen, where they can radiocarbon date where the layers that the pollen was found in, and that can allow them to identify the time period when that pollen was released. And then they can also identify to genus and sometimes species, what types of species were growing around where that pollen core was collected. And so these are the data here. They're relatively complex to try to understand. So I've just highlighted the key, but here we're looking at depth through this core in centimeters, from 10 to 180 centimeters deep they went. And then they turn this into dates. So this is up to 3,000 years ago is this first section I highlighted in red, and it goes back all the way to 12,000 years ago is how far back this pollen core went. So a lot of useful data in there. And what you can see right away, especially if we look at these first 2 columns, this is pine pollen here. So the darker the bar, and kind of the wider it is, the more pollen you found in that species. And then this is spruce pollen. Now we can't separate out black and white and red spruce, so we just call them all spruce collectively. What you can see is that between about 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, spruce was relatively common at Blackwoods. And then there was a period of about 8,000 years where it was primarily pine dominated. And yes, there was some birch, and for a little while there was some hemlock in there. It was primarily pine dominated for a major about 8,000 year period. Still a little bit of spruce here and there. Then you can see in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, that's when spruce really came back into this forest. And so this kind of puts our short-term human perspective on the value and the persistence of these coastal spruce-fir forests into a larger context where there are these big changing dynamics and changes in forest ecosystems. So the question kind of becomes, well, what is it that really drove that change? As many of you know, it's some historical warming. And if we look at some of the regional, these are broader scale patterns in warming over that same time period, you can see that around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, that the temperature on average was a little bit cooler than the average over this whole period. That's that red box there that corresponds to the spruce dominance here. And then also the last 3,000 years or so have been relatively cooler than average, and that corresponds to when we have spruce dominating over the last 3,000 years. And then we got up to about a half a degree, or maybe 0.6 of a degree warmer during this middle period, and that's when it was warm enough to start favoring pine over spruce in this stand. Okay, that's fine, but what does that mean for the future, right? So how do we put this into the context of what we're expecting for future warming? And so I can actually add some projections here on what we're expecting by 2100. So this is a best case scenario by 2100, the approximate amount of warming we're looking at. So we'll be somewhere up here on this graph. So quite a bit above where we've been in the past and where a little bit of warming led to a major ecosystem change. And then our worst case scenario by 2100 puts us probably actually above my slide. And so the temperatures are going to be very, very different in these stands, and they're going to be much warmer than they were even during this mid-Holocene warm period that favored different species. Now, it looks like I just kind of drew vertical lines here, but those are, I mean, I kind of did, but remember all this warming we're expecting is by 2100. If you look at the scale here, remember this right here is 2000 years. So a 100-year time scale is just about the width of one of those arrows that I've drawn. So this is going to happen really, really quickly. So it's a little bit scary to look at some of those things, and we have to start thinking, well, what does that mean for the persistence of these spruce systems as we move forward? And so this is not new. This is maybe a different way than you've seen it presented before, but we've done this with suitable habitat models. And so this is some work looking at spruce-fir habitat, in this case, particularly red spruce, across all of New England and up into Canada, using records of historical distributions and historical climate, trying to project where is the suitable climate for the species going to be in the future. And so this is the coastal Maine. You might recognize here Mount Desert Island as a reference point for you, and there's the Penobscot Bay. And the dark red colors here represent suitable habitat for spruce. This is modeled suitable habitat for spruce currently. So you can see that there's quite a bit of suitable habitat for spruce along the coast. However, as many of you know, the Gulf of Maine and the northeastern US is warming extremely rapidly, in some cases more rapidly than most of the world. So we're expecting a lot of change, and that's what was kind of depicted on that previous graph. And so if we take that suitable habitat and project it forward for the same region, we find that the species distribution models, while they are uncertain about some of the coastal influences, the large-scale changes suggest that there will be no suitable habitat for spruce on the coast of Maine by 2090. And actually, if you just look at 2060, the changes are just about as extreme as this. So that's between 40 and 70 years from now, where we will have no suitable habitat. And so this is zoomed in right on the coast, and you may say, okay, but what about bigger picture changes, or maybe it's going to be just further, a little bit further north. If you actually zoom out and look at the images from this publication, you can just jump over to this right-hand graphic here. This is the predicted change in suitable habitat for red spruce just by 2060. And the red colors here are all places where it's going to lose suitable habitat. So you can see most of the entire state of Maine and most of New England is going to lose suitable habitat for spruce. But what many of you are picking up on is I'm calling it suitable habitat. So it doesn't mean that we won't have spruce there. It's just that they won't be living in the habitats that they've ever lived in before. Namely meaning they won't be experiencing the same climate conditions they've experienced before. So this raises the question, how will these coastal spruce forest types change to other forest types? Or will they be able to stay the same? So how will we get a shift though? I mean, how will this actually happen, and how rapidly might this happen when we have a change in the composition and structure of this forest to something that's maybe dominated by more deciduous hardwoods? And what does that mean for the ecosystem services and the other values that that ecosystem provides us in the in-between stage? So rather than trying to get into all of that, because that's a big question, that's the million-dollar question, I'm going to talk about two things that I'm studying that help us interpret or understand a little bit about how some of that change may occur. One of those is microclimate and forest understories. And the other one is talking a little bit about the physiological stress tolerance of the existing trees. I think this is where we still have a lot to learn. So this is better trying to understand how these remaining trees may be able to survive or withstand some of the localized extreme conditions that they're expected to experience with climate change. So first, let's talk about the microclimate, some of these coastal spruce fir forest understories. And so we've measured this at 6 sites in Acadia National Park, enforced in the understories. This looks like this was at Blackwoods, but here you can see we've got this cup attached to a stake. Inside that cup, we've got a little eye button temperature and humidity sensor. And we also have a temperature sensor that's buried at 10 centimeters deep in a latex balloon to protect it from moisture. That's allowing us to track every 2 hours the temperature of the soil and then the temperature and the relative humidity of the air in that forest. And the graphic here is representing the average across all of our 12 sensors across the 6 sites. And this is the average daily maximum, the top of this line, just through the month of August. The middle line here is the average daily temperature through the month of August, and then the lower line is the average daily minimum temperature. And the y-axis is representing temperature. So this is August of 2020. And the second graphic is representing the vapor pressure deficit. So vapor pressure deficit, you can just think of as the drying pressure of the air. It's kind of how dry the air is and how much the plant is going to lose water to that dry air. We can talk more about that in the discussion if you're interested. And these values are represented in kilopascals. So you don't have to really know what this means right now, but it stays usually below about 2 kilopascals. So that means that it doesn't really get too dry. If these values got even higher and higher, that would be strong evaporative demand for these trees. Okay, so here's the temperatures, something like 15 to 25 degrees Celsius and less than 2 kilopascals of vapor pressure deficit. What does that mean for plants? Well, this is where physiology comes in. And here I'll just use some published values that we can use to try to interpret this. So this is some physiological data from red spruce. So the top graphic is showing how photosynthesis responds to temperature, and the lower graphic is showing how photosynthesis responds to the vapor pressure deficit. So it aligns with the 2 graphics I'm showing on the left here. So for red spruce, you can see that photosynthesis stays relatively stable as we approach to 32 degrees Celsius, which is pretty hot. Then after that, it starts to decline very rapidly. And so that's where you start to have some damage, some heat damage to some of the molecules and the membranes inside of the plant cells, so they're not able to function efficiently. And so you can kind of line your eye up with, okay, somewhere around 32 is where it gets bad. Oh, good, we don't get anywhere near 32 in these forest understories, so that's good for red spruce. We can also look at the vapor pressure deficit as we go from 0 up to 4 kilopascals here. You can see a pretty linear decline in photosynthesis. But in this range of 0 to 2, where we typically are, there's not actually much of a pattern. And so these plants are able to photosynthesize pretty strongly at these relatively low vapor pressure deficits, which is also a good thing. But if we get above 2, then you can see we start to decline. By the time we get to 2.5, we've almost halved our photosynthesis. So it doesn't take much more change to drive declines in photosynthesis. Now, some of the reasons for this, though, are that I'm measuring this in the understory. So keep in mind, this is just for the advanced regeneration in the understory that we'd be looking at. This is likely very different than what the plants are experiencing in their canopies. The forest canopies may be experiencing warmer and drier temperatures. But to put this in context, we've done some other experimental work that demonstrates how the microclimate in the understory can really rapidly change and how that can all of a sudden push some of these trees beyond some of their physiological stress thresholds. And so an experiment here at the University of Maine, led by a former master's student, Kelly French, we did a canopy disturbance, so where we had a number of trees where we were tracking a whole bunch of things about their physiology. These are canopy red spruce trees, and then we removed a whole bunch of competition around those trees. And we tracked the microclimate in the understory around those trees as well. And so this top graphic is showing maximum temperature, the bottom graphic is showing vapor pressure deficit. And the initial period of time here is before we did the thinning. The black dots represent the control trees that were not thinned around, and the open circles represent the trees that were thinned around. And this gray line demarcates right when we did the thinning. And what you can see is we did the thinning right before a heat wave, actually, so it got really hot, over 30 degrees Celsius. But you can also see that the temperature around the thinned trees on average was a couple of degrees Celsius even warmer, and the vapor pressure deficit was a half a kilopascal to a kilopascal higher in those thin stands as well. And that's kind of represented with these lines over here, where as you increase the daily maximum temperature, a thin stand can have a temperature that's 2 or even 3 degrees Celsius warmer than one that's hasn't been recently thinned. And the vapor pressure deficit can be as much as almost an entire kilopascal dry. And so those are very likely to all of a sudden surpass those physiological thresholds we talked about, where red spruce starts to see declines around 32. Here you can see we've surpassed it during this heat wave, and more so in the thin stands. And you can see we spent spent quite a bit of time above this kind of 2 kilopascal limit, and those thin stands are more likely to experience that as well. And so this isn't just pointing a finger at harvesting and thinning operations, because we know that those are really important conservation tools, but this also means as the forest canopy begins to suffer, or you have mortality in the canopy, you lose some of the buffering effect in the understory, and so you have effectively more rapid rates of climate change experience in the understory that can be detrimental for the plants that are adapted to those cool and moist understory conditions. And so that's just a glimpse into some of the physiology that we do in the microclimate studies that we use to link it up to the field. We've also got an experimental study that's happening right now. This Friday is when the droughts start, and next week we start our experimental heat waves. But we're looking at the physiological response of regeneration of red spruce, red oak, and paper birch to drought, heat waves, competition, and actually combinations of all of those different factors. And so this is run by a student of mine, Alexander Berry, in my lab. And as an example right here, you can see we've got a little red spruce sapling growing next to a red oak sapling. And this is kind of trying to help us better understand now the regeneration side of things. And as we have these two species competing for this new ecological space, how does the competition between them impact how they respond to things like these extreme climate events? And then also, how do they individually respond to these extreme climate events as well? So we'll be conducting that this summer. If anybody's up this way on the Orono campus and wants to check out the experiment, just let me know. I'd be happy to show you around, and I'll hopefully be able to report back to you next year with some exciting results on that study. Then I wanted to wrap up just talking about another new study we've got going on. This was recently funded through the Northeastern States Research Cooperative. This is a collaboration with a whole bunch of folks, including Nick at the Schoodic Institute, where we're looking at the impacts of some of these extreme climate events, like the ones I was just talking about, on tree regeneration in the northern forest. And here we're really focused on heat waves, drought, and actually midwinter warming events. And so we've all experienced these kind of really warm temperatures in the middle of the winter time. Here we're trying to better understand how that impacts the physiology and the dormancy of some of the woody plants that we have in these forests. And so at these 6 sites distributed along this distance coast gradient, we're going to be setting up some experimental infrastructure that allows us to test how these different treatment conditions impact the growth, physiology, and survival of some of these trees. So keep an eye out for that one as well. With that, that's all I wanted to use as an introduction to the topic. I'll just say thanks for your attention and time today, and I'm happy to chat about any questions you have about coastal spruce systems or anything about forests in general. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jay. And if you can unshare your screen, that would be good. I'm going to ask people to, I think you can raise your hand in Zoom. I forget if you can do that or not, but if you can, please use the hand raising if you have a question or a comment. And I do have one for you, Jay. I'm imagining here, as elsewhere, nighttime temperatures are increasing. And I'm wondering if you see or you expect similar impacts of changes in nighttime temperature on photosynthesis, growth, et cetera, as you do with daytime temperatures? Or is that really not much of a consideration that plant physiological ecologists think about?
Good question, Tim. Yeah, I was focusing on the midday temperatures because that's kind of when we hit these extremes, and those become important because plants do a lot of different stuff in the middle of the day. Like when it gets really dry or really hot, they can actually close their stomata so that they stop losing as much water so quickly. But as we know, when they close their stomata to conserve water, they're also not able to bring carbon dioxide in. So that has a direct impact on a reduction in carbon sequestration. But the nighttime temperatures is interesting. So we are seeing increases in nighttime temperatures. And I think, as you probably know, this changes the baseline respiration rates for organisms. So stuff that you've studied runs around. These trees don't run around, but they still have the baseline respiration rate to stay alive, just like we do. And so if we heat them up, then their baseline respiration rates go up. And so that's kind of a longer term trade-off that we get with warming, where it's going to kind of basically start cutting into some of the carbon gains that the plants are getting during the day. Now, the interesting thing about these systems and some of the work I've done in mountain spruce-fir systems is we typically think of them as cold limited systems. And so a little bit of warming actually isn't necessarily considered to be a bad thing. And so the other trade-off we're still trying to figure out is how the expanded growing season for some of these cold limited systems that we get with warming. So now you have more time during the summer to actually sequester carbon, how that trades off with also higher likelihood of hitting extreme conditions that are unfavorable. And as you just mentioned, kind of this increase in respiration rates, that's also cutting into your carbon gain. And then that compounded with new species coming in that are better adapted to those conditions, for example. So there's still a lot of unknowns around those, how those mechanisms are going to impact the dynamics of the forest for sure.
Great, thank you. Other folks have questions for Jay? Jesse, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. Hey, Jay, great presentation. Thank you for that. A couple of questions. One, sort of what you think about sort of the influence of fog that may have in the changes that might happen on the extreme coastal areas where the spruce are. And if you predict, or maybe this is getting at with your competition study, how might there be differences in how like almost pure stands of spruce might change as opposed to the real mixed spruce and deciduous like canopy, I guess, and any thoughts there?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jesse. The fog is a tough one. I think that's part of where some of these suitable habitat models and even the gap and vegetation models kind of struggle. Is that's kind of it's a tough thing to quantify how that's going to impact it and exactly where it's going to impact it. The concern is that the Gulf of Maine is warming really, really fast too. So I won't pretend to know what that means for the future of fog along the coast. But I do know we still have plenty of hot and sunny days along the coast of Maine. And so I think that's going to be, again, one of those trade-offs where we're still going to have a lot of really stressful conditions. And it's really going to be, to use an overused word these days, the resilience of those trees to be able to handle some really stressful conditions, but to be able to come back into some of these foggy conditions that do have a strong benefit for them. I think we may have a little bit to learn from some of these Western systems that rely on fog as a moisture input. It may be, I know there's a lot of work on redwoods and foliar water uptake and things like that. Our trees are not really adapted to those kinds of dry conditions though, so I doubt that there's too much to learn there, but there may be a little bit of a story there that's worth exploring. And then to your question around a mixed stand versus more of a pure stand, this is actually a research question we're working on in the lab right now. And I think it comes back to that microclimate buffering story. So I'll just take your question towards something that I can actually, I think I can answer it. It's what you're supposed to do. A lot of what we've been thinking about in the lab lately is how the phenology of the canopy actually impacts the buffering in the understory. And so if you have a pure spruce-fir stand that can be relatively dense and has an evergreen canopy, you can have pretty consistent buffering effects on the microclimate in the understory, which can be really beneficial for those conspecific species of spruce and fir, the advanced regeneration. But if you have a patchwork of that in the spring and fall, when you don't have leaves on those deciduous trees, you're more likely to be experiencing some more extreme conditions in the understory. And I think that's going to be some of those tipping points that are going to shift regeneration responses away from spruce and fir, other species that are adapted to those more buffered understory conditions, towards species that can handle some of those more extremes. So I think you're exactly right.
That makes sense.
Those kinds of things are going to make a big difference.
Thanks.
Yep.
Tim, I'm going to raise my hand the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Hey, Jay, good to see you. Awesome presentation. Really fun to see all of these data and preliminary results. I was curious with, you showed some thresholds with air temperature and vapor pressure or vapor pressure deficit. And I was wondering, is there an interaction between those two that, as the temperatures warm, will we get to those higher levels of vapor pressure deficit? Do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Nick. Short answer is yes. When you have the hotter temperature, when you take a given packet of air that has a certain amount of moisture in it, you warm it up, that's going to lower its vapor pressure deficit. And I think one of the things I always like to talk about related to this is kind of, sometimes it's the elephant in the room, but I don't think it's an elephant. It's the fact that we're expecting more precipitation in the future, right? and I always talk about drought and how important it is to understand drought for these trees. Vapor pressure deficit is really the atmospheric drought component, and that's definitely going to go up, especially with warming, even if we have kind of relatively even moisture inputs into the atmosphere. But the seasonality and the episodic nature of precipitation is also going to lead to the soil moisture drought on top of that. So I think that's one of the other factors that really plays into the equation of plants are responding to the atmosphere, which is temperature, heat, and light, and those other things, but they're also responding to what we've seen in the soil. So, and some of the work that we did on some of the research plots on Acadia, that when you have no soil moisture, the plants are not going to do much. You have really dry conditions in a lot of your stands, right? That kind of dominated the signal. But even at the stands, like the Scudic Point stand that had plenty of soil moisture for the whole growing season, those plants still shut down photosynthesis most days as they approached higher vapor pressure deficits and temperatures. And those were on just kind of regular sunny days, like you saw in the picture in my opening slide. So they're experiencing this pretty regularly. It's a question of how does that trade off over the course of an entire growing season and slowly start to shift competitive dynamics between different species.
And really interesting to see the these physiological responses of the advanced regeneration. Do you have a sense whether, or if there are any, or if you have any hypotheses on how that compares with mature individuals with the overstory trees?
That's a tough one. It's mixed. Overstory trees have a lot of other things going for them. If you're trying to do kind of leaf level descriptions, there's a lot of plasticity in these metrics within a species, actually. So they do have ability to acclimate in things. I don't think I can give just kind of a blanket answer that overstory trees are more or less sensitive to that. What we do know is that the canopy, for example, is much more likely to be exposed to higher temperatures and higher vapor pressure deficits. So they're going to be exposed to that more often, but then they have other things, like they have a whole trunk full of water that they can use to replenish the water that's lost from that canopy. So it's kind of a mix of, they may have the same sensitivity, but they may have higher exposure for canopy trees in terms of at the leaf level, but then they have other adaptations like a broader root system and a trunk full of water that they can lean on. Whereas the understory trees tend to have less exposure because they're buffered in some ways from the overstory conditions. But they may be slightly more sensitive to some of those things, maybe not at the individual leaf level, but at the whole organism level, where they have shallower roots and less stored water that they can rely on. And I don't know, there's been some interesting research coming out on that stored water component, where a lot of trees, somewhere between 10 and up to even like 30 or 40% of the daily water use of a tree actually comes out of the swelling and shrinking of the trunk of the tree. And so all day the tree water is drawn down from the tree, and the tree actually shrinks a little bit, and then at night it kind of fills back up like a sponge. And that's a really important component that the canopy trees are able to take advantage of, that these smaller sapling and seedlings are not able to take advantage of as much.
David, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Jay, for that interesting presentation. I'm curious about how this all relates to growth rates of the trees. Did you core any of the trees? And with these differing conditions, did you see evidence that tree growth rates were changing over time?
Yeah, good question, David. Yeah, so that's a tough one to pull apart because there's always the stand dynamics occurring when you look back in time at this. But we do have some preliminary data. We're still working those cores up. We do have some preliminary data that supports our general notion that actually these trees are sensitive to precipitation, which I get some pushback when I mention that, because oftentimes we think about Maine isn't really a moisture limited system. We have a lot of rain here, right? Especially as you move inland. But what we find relatively consistently in a lot of these stands, and even as you move up into the boreal forest, if you look at tree rings, you find that the tree rings are larger, usually the year following a relatively wet summer. So that suggests that there is a limitation to water. And we did see that the red spruce trees in Acadia were sensitive to the prior year. I think it was either July or August, if I'm remembering correctly, at I think 5 of the 6 stands where we had cores when we did our preliminary look. So there at least is a signal on summer precip. Now we haven't done what you're mentioning is kind of a moving window analysis where you try to look at that sensitivity is changing over time. It's tough to do that when you only have like 100 or 120 years of data. So we're kind of working on that one, and that's definitely one of the questions that we're going to try to ask to see if we can see an increase in sensitivity to some of these metrics. And the other thing that we're working on in the lab with a related project, that's all at the annual time scales, looking back at these increment cores. We have a project at the Howland Research Forest just north of Orono here, about 45 minutes, where we've got 30 trees, many of them red spruce trees that are hooked up to point dendrometers that measure the diameter of the tree at 15-minute intervals. And so we're actually able to see at the daily or sub-daily time scale how tree growth responds to things like the vapor pressure deficit during a given week or something, and the maximum temperatures. And so that's going to help us tease apart what's happening within a given year as well. So you're on the right track though, because it's important how this stuff eventually scales to growth. And one of the other interesting things, some of the work that Nick and I have done together too, is in these forests, we always look at increment cores and diameter growth because that's the easiest thing to get with just drill into the tree. But the thing that really matters for the tree is actually height growth, right? They really need to get to the sunlight. It's really the ability to reach the canopy. And so the way that these stressors impact height growth, which is more challenging to measure and track in the field, is actually the thing that's going to help us better understand how this changes competitive dynamics of those trees, I think. So thanks for the question, David.
I don't know if other people have questions, please chime in. And if not, Jay, I've got two questions for you. One is about the substance. Oh, Kate, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. So I just had to turn on my
I understand.
camera.
Yep.
So speaking of like climate, trying to think of like other parameters that growth might relate to besides just like the obvious like minimum temperature, maximum temperature, like getting more creative, like what do you think might be good predictors of growth?
Well, you're trying to get me to come up with parameters for you to put into your model, aren't you? It's a tough one. I guess I'll just give you the day-to-day things that matter for a plant are actually the things like the vapor pressure deficit, to keep bringing that up. So how dry the air gets, the duration of time that vapor pressure deficit is above a certain threshold, which causes the plant to close its stomata. So that equals less carbon gained for the plant. So, but that's a really tough thing to have good data on, and to have good data on that for a long time scale, which I think is what you probably want. So something that helps us get at that duration of like daily duration of stress metric, which is why we often just use maximum temperature, which is much easier to get. So those daily maximum temperatures. And those are things like the heating degree day metrics and those types of things. So those combined with the lagged effects, I think, is the other big challenge. When you track an individual carbon atom, when it was sequestered by a plant and when it actually goes into a ring, it can be a couple of years later. It's usually either the first year that it was sequestered, or in evergreen species, it's often, if it was anything except for early in the growing season, it's going to be put into next year's growth ring, which is why we see such persistent lags. And so most of what we see for the climate influence on increment cores for species like spruce and fir are lagged effects. A lot of the important things, especially precipitation type or water balance type metrics. So I don't think that's a super satisfying answer for you. But I think if you buy me lunch sometime, we can actually sit on the coast of Maine and talk about this. We probably could come up with some cool models and some important interactions that we can put together with some of the data that are available for trying to look at that stuff for sure. But it'd be really cool if we can do a better job at linking it to the mechanisms by which those temperatures and moisture variables impact growth. My big frustration has always been like, trees don't care about a month, right? We always break these things down to monthly values, but the tree doesn't care that it's in August versus in September. It cares what the actual climate is in a given window of time too. And so by splitting these climate variables, just defaulting them up into individual months, it's like a whole another ball game that we could try to address. So
Thanks.
Yep.
And yeah, we'll have lunch sometime soon.
Okay, that sounds good.
Other questions or comments or reactions for Jay? And feel free to raise your hand or just turn your camera on and raise your physical hand if you'd like. Okay, so Jay, one question, and this was just sort of clarifying or helping me as understand this since I'm not a forest ecologist, but you had a map of species habitat distribution. You basically showed that the models show that in 40 to 70 years, there's no spruce fir forest habitat along the coast. So does that mean that those trees are gonna die off and be replaced by other species and other forest types in that time frame? And if so, do we have any understanding of what that looks like? Have we ever experienced a forest outside of agricultural systems, had a forest type change occur at that sort of pace?
So the first part of your question, that's the big unknown. What we pretend to do with those suitable habitat models is say that we've identified the fundamental niche space, so the range of climate conditions that plant can possibly live in. But we do that just based on looking at where it is or where it's been in the past and what the climate was in all those locations, and then project that forward. So it doesn't actually give us the fundamental niche space of that species. It's really some version of the realized niche. So it's just kind of where it happens to be based on all the other selection pressures it's gone through. So that's kind of where the physiology in these experimental studies we do comes in, because there likely will be a bunch of red spruce in Maine in 40 and even in 70 years. The question is, what are the thresholds that are actually going to start to kill some segment of that? There's going to be a whole bunch of dead spruce at those times as well, and it's going to be individual microclimate conditions or individual landscape features or dry ridges or something like that, or if a specific heat wave hits at just the wrong time of year in the wrong location or something. So it's going to be spottier. But what we need to know is what is the true fundamental niche of those species, and to get that you have to take individual trees and push them beyond the thresholds, beyond the temperature and precipitations conditions they've ever experienced in the past, which is extremely hard to do, especially for big trees. That's why I want to try to get Walmart to sponsor me and like build a big giant warehouse that we can put a big forest in, and we can actually control everything about the climate in there, something like the Truman Show or something, right? Where then we can actually see how they respond to consistent temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius and hit them with a drought and stuff. So that's the big unknown. And then the other part of your question is, do we have examples of that? There's some examples. A lot of the stuff you read in the news about what's happening out west, it's rarely kind of just a heat wave or just a drought that drives, but these mass mortality events that we're seeing in the Western United States, those are the examples of massive shifts. But the difference there is it's almost always a huge moisture deficit that is partly driving that. So for this to happen in a more mesic system is relatively at such a rapid rate, is a much more kind of novel transition that we don't have a good understanding of what's gonna happen there, I don't think.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
And then the other question I had is not related to your research, but it's inspired by one of your slides. And I just want to congratulate you on really great slide design. Excellent examples of good science communication. And in particular, it was a slide where you showed the graphs of different age classes of trees in these different plots, and then you had the photographs of what these to a person today. And the question is this, and I have a lot of interest in the history of ecology. So back in the 1950s, the very famous and influential ecologist, mathematical ecologist Robert MacArthur, studied warblers in the spruce stands on Bass Harbor Head. And, it became a very influential paper, and it led to his ideas about very fine scale micro partitioning of niches between species. There are these multiple species of warblers that are in the same stands, and the dogma at the time is they shouldn't be able to do that. And it turns out some were feeding only on the edges of the branches, and some were feeding closer to the trunk, and some were foraging high and some were foraging low. So they sort of partitioned this resource that way. And I think one of the criticisms of that paper is how did he possibly see these warblers in a really dense stand of spruce? But I'm wondering, based on your slide, if in the 1950s, Bass Harbor Head spruce forests actually looked like what what was the other spot you had?
Like Blackwoods or one of those other
Yeah,
ones.
Blackwoods, right. Looks like now, which was actually a bit more open than what Bass Harbor Head looks like right now. And that was my interpretation of that. And I don't know if that's right or not, but maybe that has some impact on my understanding, at least, of what MacArthur was doing back in the 50s.
Yeah, I'd be interested to look back at that a little bit more carefully. We should also remember that this is a relatively small, narrow transect that we ran, and Bass Harbor Head is a relatively large area. So I'm not sure exactly where he was doing those surveys, but your interpretation is correct. I mean, you can actually look at those diameter distributions and say that, okay, this is the diameter distribution 60 years ago. And so this is what it would look like. And we have good examples of that. So you can actually see that successional change. So yeah, you're exactly right. And I wouldn't doubt that the changes that we've seen at Bass Harbor Head have changed the warblers and how they're interacting with that vegetation structure for sure.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions or comments, so we'll wrap up there, and I'll just let everybody know on this call that our next brown bag, we do not have one next week, the holiday week. It was impossible to schedule people at that time. So our next one is Wednesday, the 13th. And we will have Richard Kuntner, who's going to come and give a presentation on his observations and experience with resource management in Europe. So some international perspectives and what can be learned and might be applied to Acadia. So with that, we can sign off. And Jay, thank you again so much for a great presentation. Excellent slide design. And I thank everybody on the call for joining. So take care, everybody, and look for this recording on the Schoodic Institute YouTube channel soon.
Thank you. Good to see you all.